Germany, summer 1932. The Weimar Republic still exists in name, in law, in constitutional form, but in spirit, it is already under siege. What defines this summer is not an election, not a speech, not a single decision made in a cabinet room. What defines it is violence organized, normalized, and increasingly accepted as a fact of political life. The collapse of German democracy does not begin with a coup or a revolution. It begins with blood on the pavement and with institutions that choose to look away. In April 1932, the government had imposed a ban on the Nazi Party's paramilitary organizations, the Sturmabteilung SA and the Schutzstaffel SS. These formations were not mere political clubs. They were disciplined street armies, trained for intimidation, provocation, and outright combat. The ban was an acknowledgement long overdue that democracy could not survive if one party maintained a private militia. But the ban did not last. By June, under pressure from conservative elites and with the full backing of Chancellor Franz von Papen, the prohibition was lifted. The justification was familiar: restoring order, ensuring fairness, calming tensions by allowing all parties equal rights. In reality, it was a catastrophic miscalculation. The moment the SA and SS were unleashed, Germany's streets became battlegrounds. This was not spontaneous chaos, it was structured, deliberate violence. Nazi formations marched into working-class neighborhoods known to be communist strongholds. Communist groups responded in kind. Police forces often sympathetic to the nationalist right intervened selectively, sometimes brutally, sometimes not at all. Within weeks, the death toll rose rapidly. Conservative estimates placed it at over 100 killed. Other counts suggested 300 or more by the end of the summer. People were not just beaten in street clashes. They were stabbed in taverns, shot in doorways, dragged from their homes at night. Violence seeped into everyday life. Political allegiance became a death sentence. Yet what is most striking is not simply that violence occurred, but that it was increasingly treated as normal. Newspapers reported it with routine detachment. Politicians spoke of it abstractly as disturbances or excesses. Emergency decrees replaced political debate. The Republic's immune system was failing. Nowhere was this clearer than in Altona. On July 17, 1932, 7,000 uniformed Nazis marched through Altona, a densely populated working-class district near Hamburg, known for its strong communist presence. The route was deliberately provocative. Everyone involved, Nazis, communists, police, and political leaders, knew what would happen. Clashes broke out almost immediately. Stones were thrown, shots rang out. Panic spread through narrow streets filled with families, bystanders, and children. By the end of the day, 18 people lay dead, many more were wounded. The official story was swift and convenient. Communist snipers had fired on police and marchers, forcing security forces to respond. It was a narrative that aligned perfectly with conservative fears and authoritarian ambitions. It painted the left as inherently violent, incapable of governing, a threat to public order. But later investigations told a different story. The fatal shots did not come from communist rooftops. They came from the police themselves firing indiscriminately into crowds. The truth, however, no longer mattered. In a republic already hollowed out by emergency rule, facts were less powerful than fear. Altona became a symbol, not of tragedy but of opportunity. The violence was seized upon by Chancellor von Papen and his allies as proof that Germany's largest state, Prussia, was ungovernable under democratic leadership. Prussia was no ordinary state. It was the backbone of the republic, home to the majority of Germany's population, its largest police force, and its last functioning democratic government under social democratic leadership. If Prussia could be neutralized, democracy itself would be crippled. The Weimar Constitution, designed to protect democracy, now became the instrument of its undoing. Article 48, intended for genuine emergencies, allowed the president to rule by decree. It had already been used repeatedly during the Great Depression. Each use made the next easier. Law had become habit. Habit became precedent. What was unfolding in the summer of 1932 was not a breakdown of the state. It was something more dangerous, the state functioning as designed, but in service of authoritarian ends. And crucially, this was not driven by popular Nazi rule, not yet. Adolf Hitler was still outside government. The Nazis were not in power. What they possessed instead was momentum generated by fear, by spectacle, by the perception that they were the only force capable of imposing order on a collapsing system. This perception did not arise naturally. It was cultivated by elites who believed they could harness Nazi energy for their own purposes, by institutions that prioritized stability over legality, and by democratic leaders who hesitated when decisiveness was required. The streets were violent because the state allowed them to be. The Nazis benefited because others believed they could be controlled. And before we go any further, if you're finding this breakdown of history valuable, please click the subscribe button and like this video. It genuinely helps bring serious historical analysis to more people, and it supports the work that makes content like this possible. By late July, Germany stood at a crossroads. The bloodshed of the streets had created the pretext. The Constitution provided the mechanism. What remained was the decision. The Republic was bleeding, but it was not yet dead. What happened next would determine whether democracy would resist or quietly step aside. On the morning of July 20th, 1932, democracy in Germany was overthrown without a single tank rolling through the streets, without gunfire in parliament, without a declaration of dictatorship. What took place instead was something far more insidious, a coup executed entirely through legal language, constitutional loopholes, and bureaucratic force. It would later be known as the Prussian Coup, and it marked the decisive rupture, the Weimar Republic's ability to defend itself. At the center of it all stood Chancellor Franz von Papen. Papen was not a Nazi. He did not wear a brown shirt or shout into microphones before roaring crowds. He was an aristocrat, a Catholic conservative, a man of elite confidence who believed that democracy had already failed and that Germany required firm guidance from above. Like many in his class, he viewed the Social Democrats as the real threat, not the Nazis. The violence in Altona provided him with exactly what he needed. Invoking Article 48 of the Weimar Constitution, Papen declared that the elected government of Prussia had failed to maintain public order. President Paul von Hindenburg, elderly and increasingly detached, signed the emergency decree without resistance. With a few strokes of a pen, Germany's largest democratic stronghold was stripped of its authority. Papen appointed himself Reich Commissioner for Prussia. The implications were enormous. Prussia controlled the majority of Germany's police force, approximately 90,000 officers. These forces were now placed under federal control, effectively removing the last major institutional barrier to authoritarian rule. The elected Prussian cabinet was dismissed. Its ministers were placed under house arrest or sidelined. All of this happened legally. No parliament was stormed. No radio stations were seized by force. There were no mass arrests of political opponents. And precisely because of this, many Germans struggled to recognize what had just occurred. But make no mistake, this was a coup. The Constitution had not been abolished, but it had been rendered meaningless. Federalism, the balance of power between states and central authority, was broken. If Prussia could be taken over by decree, any state could. If elected governments could be dismissed in the name of order, elections themselves became optional. The most tragic element of the Prussian coup was not Papen's ambition, it was the response to it. The Social Democratic Party, still the largest pro-democracy force in Germany, faced a choice. They could call for mass resistance. They had the numbers. Hundreds of thousands belonged to trade unions, workers' associations, and Republican defense organizations. The police forces of Prussia, now under Papen's control, were not uniformly loyal to him. A general strike like the one that had crushed the Kapp Putsch in 1920 was possible, but the SPD leadership refused. They feared civil war, they feared bloodshed. They feared that resistance would give the right and the Nazis the justification they sought. Instead, they chose legality, they chose restraint. They chose to appeal to the courts. It was a fatal decision. The case was brought before Germany's highest court, the Staatsgerichtshof. The court ruled weeks later with careful ambiguity. It did not fully endorse Papen's actions, but it did not reverse them either. The Prussian government was declared technically still in office, but stripped of any real power. Authority remained with Papen. Democracy had appealed to law. Law had yielded to power. Meanwhile, the streets remained tense. Violence did not disappear, it merely became background noise. Emergency decrees continued to replace parliamentary debate. The Reichstag met, but it governed nothing. Real decisions were now made by presidential advisors, generals, and conservative elites who believed themselves the last guardians of order. Adolf Hitler watched all of this closely. The Nazis did not initiate the Prussian coup. They did not need to. It accomplished many of their goals without costing them anything. The Social Democrats were humiliated. Federalism was broken, the police were centralized. And most importantly, the precedent was set. Democracy could be suspended without resistance. When Hitler later demanded similar powers, he would not be inventing something new. He would be inheriting a system already transformed. The illusion of stability was carefully maintained. Newspapers reassured readers that the Constitution remained intact, that this was a temporary measure, that order would be restored. But behind the scenes, the Republic's foundations were crumbling. Chancellor Papen believed he had outmaneuvered both the left and the Nazis. He imagined a future in which authoritarian conservatives ruled by decree, using Nazi mass support while keeping Hitler himself out of power. It was a dangerous fantasy shared by many who underestimated the movement they sought to exploit. What the Prussian coup truly revealed was not strength, but weakness. A state that cannot defend its own democratic institutions does not need to be conquered. It can be taken quietly. By late July 1932, Germany was no longer governed by democratic legitimacy. It was governed by emergency rule, elite maneuvering, and fear of instability. The Republic still breathed, but only because no one had yet decided to stop its heart. The final test was approaching, an election had been called, and for the first time, millions of Germans would be asked to decide not just between parties, but between democracy and something darker. In the shadow of collapsing institutions and normalized emergency rule, Germany entered the final phase of its democratic experiment, believing fatally that events were still manageable. Behind the public drama of elections and street violence, real power now flowed through private conversations, backroom deals, and strategic miscalculations by men who believed themselves smarter than history. Chief among them was General Kurt von Schleicher. Schleicher was not a mass politician. He never needed to be. As a senior army officer and political fixer, he operated quietly, shaping governments from behind the curtain. He had helped bring down previous chancellors, helped elevate Papen, and now believed he alone understood how to stabilize Germany without surrendering it to full dictatorship or to Adolf Hitler. His strategy was division. Schleicher understood that the greatest threat to authoritarian control was a united democratic or working-class front. So he worked methodically to prevent one from forming. He reached out selectively to trade union leaders, floating the idea of a future corporate state in which labor would have a role under strict supervision. These gestures were never meant to be fulfilled. They were meant to delay, confuse, and fracture resistance. At the same time, he sabotaged coalition talks that might have produced a parliamentary majority capable of governing. Center parties were discouraged from cooperation. Moderate conservatives were reassured that emergency rule could continue indefinitely. The goal was paralysis, not resolution. Democracy did not fall because it was overthrown. It fell because it was prevented from functioning. Within the Nazi Party itself, tensions simmered. Some leaders believed the time had come to enter government through compromise. Others, most notably Joseph Goebbels, understood that total power was closer than ever, and that restraint would only weaken momentum. Hitler listened, calculated, and waited. Meanwhile, the Nazi propaganda machine reached a level of sophistication never before seen in German politics. Joseph Goebbels transformed campaigning into spectacle. Hitler no longer traveled by train like other politicians. He flew city to city, rally to rally, presenting himself as a modern, tireless leader transcending old political rituals. In just 2 weeks, he delivered 53 speeches to massive crowds. The message was simple, endlessly repeated, and devastatingly effective. The system is broken. Every failure of parliament, every emergency decree, every street clash was used as proof. Democracy, the Nazis argued, was chaos by design. Only a unified national movement could restore order, dignity, and strength. Crucially, the Nazis no longer appeared revolutionary, they appeared inevitable. Violence continued, but it no longer shocked. As marches became routine, political killings barely made headlines. The Republic had grown accustomed to its own disintegration. What once would have provoked outrage now produced resignation. And resignation is the enemy of democracy. Many Germans did not vote for the Nazis because they believed every promise. They voted because they believed nothing else would work. Fear of communism, anger at elites, resentment of modernity, nostalgia for authority all converged. The Nazi Party became a vessel into which countless anxieties could be poured. The conservative elites watching the surge believed they were still in control. Papen believed Hitler could be boxed in. Schleicher believed Hitler could be divided. Industrialists believed Nazi mass support could be harnessed and neutralized. Even President Hindenburg believed that the old order would ultimately prevail. They all shared the same illusion that they were using the Nazis. In reality, the Nazis were using them. By hollowing out democratic institutions, by normalizing authoritarian governance, by sidelining elected power in favor of emergency rule, these elites had done the Nazis' work for them. Hitler no longer needed to destroy democracy. It had been dismantled in advance. And before we move further, please click the subscribe button and like this video if you're finding this historical breakdown insightful. Your support helps ensure that complex history like this reaches more people and remains part of the public conversation. As July drew to a close, the election loomed. It would not restore democracy, it would not resolve the crisis. But it would do something far more dangerous. It would legitimize extremism on a mass scale. For the first time, millions of Germans were prepared to grant their consent not to a functioning system, but to its replacement. The illusion of control was about to shatter. On July 31, 1932, Germany went to the polls. There were no tanks in the streets, no suspension of voting, no obvious sign to the casual observer that this election would mark one of the most consequential moments in modern history. Ballots were cast in orderly fashion, polling stations were busy. Turnout exceeded 84%, one of the highest in German history. On the surface, this looked like democracy functioning. In reality, it was democracy's final act. The context in which Germans voted mattered more than the vote itself. The Reichstag had been rendered powerless by emergency decrees. Prussia, the Republic's democratic backbone, had been neutralized by the Prussian coup. Street violence had become routine. Political debate had been replaced by spectacle, fear, and exhaustion. This election was not a choice between governing programs. It was a referendum on democracy's credibility. When the results came in, they were staggering. The National Socialist German Workers' Party won over 37% of the vote, securing 230 seats and becoming the largest party in the Reichstag. No party in Weimar history had ever risen so rapidly or so dramatically. In just 2 years, the Nazis had transformed themselves from a radical French movement into the dominant force in German politics. Yet the numbers tell a more complex and more troubling story. Nazi support was strongest in small towns, rural areas, and provincial communities. Many voters were middle-aged or older. Many were middle class. This was not simply a rebellion of the desperate or the unemployed. It was a mass political realignment driven by fear of disorder, resentment toward modern urban life, and a longing for authority. 5 million Germans were unemployed, but economic despair alone does not explain the outcome. Other parties offered economic relief. What the Nazis offered was certainty. They promised to end chaos, crush enemies, and restore a sense of national purpose. And crucially, they did so within the framework of elections. This is what made the moment so dangerous. The Nazi breakthrough did not come through revolution or force. It came through participation in a system that had already been stripped of its safeguards. The vote did not create dictatorship, but it legitimized those who would soon dismantle what remained of democratic life. For conservative elites, the results were both alarming and tempting. The Nazis had won, but they did not have an absolute majority. Papen and his allies took comfort in this. They believed Hitler could still be controlled, still be used as a mass base for an authoritarian system led by traditional elites. The logic persisted: bring the Nazis into power, but not fully. Share authority, contain the radicalism. History would prove how catastrophically wrong this assumption was. For the left, the results were devastating. The Social Democrats and Communists together still commanded millions of votes, but they remained bitterly divided. Mutual hostility prevented cooperation. Each believed the other posed the greater threat. This division, carefully encouraged by figures like Schleicher, ensured continued paralysis. The Reichstag convened, but it was ungovernable. No stable majority existed. Emergency decrees continued. Parliamentary democracy had become ceremonial, a stage set behind which real power was exercised elsewhere. What July 31, 1930 to truly represented was mass consent under conditions of institutional collapse. Germans did not vote knowing they were choosing war, genocide, or dictatorship. They voted believing they were choosing order over chaos. That belief, cultivated by propaganda, enabled by elites, and reinforced by fear, was the final ingredient. The road to catastrophe did not require a coup, it required time. Within months, the conservative strategy of manipulation would collapse, Papen would fall, Schleicher would fail, and Hitler, once thought controllable, would be appointed chancellor. By then, resistance would be fragmented, institutions neutralized, and legality hollowed out beyond repair. World War II did not begin in 1939. Its foundations were laid here in the summer of 1932 when democracy was not overthrown, but surrendered. This is the lesson of Weimar's end, that democratic systems can die not only through violence, but through consent when fear outweighs freedom, and when those entrusted to defend institutions choose accommodation over defense.